Hi and welcome to another Razorback screencast. In the last episode we were looking at the textures on this arm, and I said that I would finish up some painting. I wouldn't say I finished, but I definitely added some more scratches and streaks to it. Just sort of testing it out and not being too serious about what I paint. The next step we're probably going to want to do is to mirror this over to the other side, and thankfully that's really easy. You might remember from one of the earlier screencasts that we did something very similar. So we have here the object of the right arm, which contains all of the geometry for the right arm, and we can just select it and go up to the character menu and use the mirror tool. So we want to mirror on the x-axis along the YZ, and the default settings are pretty good. And what I've done here is I've entered right, left. So we're going to replace the word right with the word left because we're mirroring from the right to the left. And then we just hit mirror and it's done. So the first thing we'll notice if we choose the paintbrush tool is that if I try to paint on one side, the exact thing is replicated on the other side. Now that might be good if that's what you want, but in this case I don't think it's what we want. The look of symmetry on these scratches makes it look very unrealistic. So what we can do is actually start off by finding the texture file. So you should know where your texture file is. Mine is right here. And just copy it. So I've taken right underscore arm, I've copied it to left underscore arm. Then we can choose our right arm material, copy, paste, and I'm just going to change the way these are laid out. So we can see the name of it a little bit better. So we have right arm, right arm. One of these is a copy, so I'm just going to make this left arm. And then we can apply it to the actual left arm texture tags. There's one more thing left to do, which is to select the material and change the file that it references. So instead of right, I'll just change it to left. So now what we have is, I'm just going to render this material. It's showing up red from some experimentation I was doing. Now we have two separate textures, two separate materials applied to two separate hierarchies. So if I go back to the brush tool, we can see that I can now paint on one, and then I can paint something different on the other. I think the reason it's giving me an X here might be because that texture isn't loaded. So if we go to the materials, we can turn it on for painting, and you can see now that we can paint different things on each arm. So that'll be really useful for differentiating these parts a little bit. Just undoing until I've undone everything. So that'll work well for like I said, differentiating these parts a little bit. So what we can do is we can go to our textures and grab the left arm texture, and just using a really large brush, go to the layers, and we see we have this black layer. So we can use a large brush. I'm just going to select my brush tool. Maybe I'll use my stylus here because I have the pressure mapped to the pen pressure. So as I apply a light touch, it'll erase this layer mask in a very light way. And if I wanted to switch the colors, I could do that as well. So I'm actually applying the layer mask, but that's not what I want to do. And so we can just sort of make some of these scratches that we've done fade. I don't want to make them go away completely because there would be scratches in similar places. And so now we can actually paint our scratches on this other arm, on the left arm, in the exact way that we want. So I'm just gonna make the size a little bit smaller, and we can zoom in. You can kind of see a yellow residue from where we had scratches previously, and we're probably still going to want to have scratches in similar spots. Right, and I need to flip my colors again. But we don't want the scratches to be exactly the same. So now we can add our own scratches on the left arm, applying a really light touch, and we can continue to paint it like that. But I'm not going to spend too much time doing this because, well, it's really just kind of an artistic process, and there's better things to spend a screencast doing. So that's how we get our arms fully textured and able to add scratches of our own. Something else I think I'd like to touch on is this front rotor. So the front rotor is an interesting object to texture. I'm just going to switch my layout back to the standard layout. The reason I think it's pretty interesting to texture is because the actual material transitions without a definitive polygonal border. So what I mean by that is these polygons here don't really follow any sort of concentric or circular pattern, but we do actually need to paint the inner part of this rotor one color while leaving the outer part a different color. So just to make the point, let's render this, but I think we have an incomplete GI based scene here, so I'm actually just going to I'm just going to delete it. We can redo that. So I'm going to turn off global illumination. I'm going to turn back on the default light. So if we render now, we get a nice rough render of our project. Now what we can start off by doing is selecting this object. Notice it's in a symmetry object, so it's going to be a little bit difficult to render just the rotor. If I say render active object, it renders nothing because we're now sort of editing a subcomponent of the symmetry object. So what we can do is we can find this object in the object manager. I've actually switched to Cinema 4D R14 because I started to feel like I needed some of the features, and we can actually just press Shift C, and I think you can say find first active material. No, that's not it. What's the command called? It is scroll to first active. So you can just press Shift C and say scroll to first active, and it actually highlights the front rotor for us. So there's actually front rotor 1. What is this? Is this just a leftover empty object? Looks like it. It doesn't have any points or anything. So we can delete that just to clean things up. There's probably a lot of empty objects in here. I guess that has to do with how I copied them out of the other project. Anyway, what we need to do is sort of apply one material in a circular fashion to the side of this rotor and apply the other material beneath it. So let's start with the base material. What we can do is use the material from the GPS modules. It has sort of an anisotropic pattern already, so I'm just control dragging it, and we can rename this rotor. We can always edit the material later on, and I'm just going to apply it to this object. So we can try a few quick renders to see if we're seeing anything. Yeah, so you know, it's got a really heavy shine. The anisotropic effect doesn't look perfect, but we can always tweak exactly what that looks like in the future. You can see sort of an effect right here, but it's definitely not what we're looking for. Anyway, it'll be a good base. So now that we have that material applied, we need to apply another material as a circular pattern. So I'll just create a new material with a bright color. The only reason I say a bright color is because that way we can see it really well. But instead of loading it in the color channel like I've just done here, we're going to create a gradient. Actually, no, my mistake. We will load it in the color channel. We're going to create a gradient in the alpha channel. And this gradient will be a circular gradient. And we can also change the interpolation from one of these other interpolation methods to none. That way, when we bring our stop over, we get a hard edge. So now that we have this material with the alpha channel cutting it out, we can actually just apply this to our front rotor 1 on top of the existing material, and you can see it sort of starts to apply itself. Now we want to change this to flat mapping because we want to be pretty deliberate in how we apply it. And then choose the texture axis tool, and we can scale this texture down so it's just big enough for our purposes, and then we can rotate it 90 degrees so the projection lines up the way we expect it to. Now we can always scale this to fine tune it, but I'd prefer to do most of the fine tuning in the gradient. So first thing is to flip the gradient. Just reverse the stops. So the white stop should be on the left and the black stop should be in the center. And we can just sort of adjust the position, and right here you see we can apply the green material in whatever fashion we want. So we can still select that material, and like I said, we can scale it to fine tune it, but it should fall right about there. So it shouldn't cover any of the holes, but it should be a little bit of sort of coloring on the inner part of the rotor. If we wanted to apply some to the outer part of the rotor, I suppose we could use this same texture map to do that. Maybe we can add some other stops and make it a band of black on the alpha channel. So it goes from black to white, and then we just adjust where the white stop is. So it looks like it would need to be maybe 62.5%. And that does give us what we're after, but I don't think it gives us the amount of control that we want over that effect. So I would actually opt to not do it in the gradient, and I would just simplify the gradient by making it white and black. To color the outside edge of the rotor, I would typically use a polygon selection. So we can select our rotor, go to polygon mode, and then using the loop tool, loop selection, we can just select these two loops of edges, and you see we have a little bit of extra edges here because of the hardening that we did for the subdivision. And so we can just go to the select tool and say grow selection. It makes our selection bigger by 1 polygon on all sides. And then we can either set selection manually, or we can just drag a new material on. I think you guys have seen, you should have seen some of my other screencasts on that sort of topic. So what we can do is we can just drag this green material onto the selection, and what it actually should have done, not clear, it doesn't look like it did it, but oh, it actually did do the proper thing. But remember, this green material that I just dragged on has an alpha channel, so we don't want to use that. Or if we do use it, we have to apply it with a different projection. Yeah, let's actually do that. So we just use one material. So we drag it on, it sets a selection for itself, it creates a new selection tag, and then instead of doing UVW mapping, we can do flat mapping again. You know, in fact, we could have just copied this first tag. Let's do that. Let's copy this first tag so we have the exact same mapping, and then add the polygon selection to it. Then we can go to our texture tool and we can scale it up. I have to make sure I'm on axis mode. You can scale it up until it's kind of hard to visualize, but until the green area gets so far to the edge that it actually fills it in. So right there, with just 2 materials and no very complex selections, we've actually been able to color these rotors. Now, of course, the final step we'd want to take is that we wouldn't want it to be green. We'd want it to be some other color. And you can also try to color the inside of all of these holes. Not as difficult as you'd think to select all of those, but it will take a little bit of work. But for now, we can basically say rotor metal. And I'm thinking this should be sort of like a dull brown, not very saturated, not very bright. Almost like silver metal that's not polished, not quite silver, has a little bit of another pigment in it. And we're kind of seeing the front rotor become a little more colorful and detailed. Since we're doing okay on time, I'll show you guys a nice quick way to select all of these inner holes. Let's see, I hit save and it's asking me if I want to save all the textures, and I'll say yes. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll say that the goal is to select the inside of all of those holes. So what you could do is you could use the loop selection tool and select each one, but that might take you forever. So I think an easier way is actually to select everything and then start deselecting things. So let's see how that would work. We'd start off by selecting all. So we have all of those holes selected, but we also have a bunch of stuff that we don't want selected. So let's start deselecting those. What we can do is we can come here to the front of the rotor. Using the loop selection tool once again, we can hold down Control to subtract these parts from the selection. Okay, that takes care of a lot of our problem all around the edge. Now we need to do the same thing to the inside part. So we use our loop selection, hold down Control, and we can deselect all of these parts. Okay, so we're getting there. Now all we have are the outside edges. If I switch to wireframe mode, it'll make it a little bit easier to see. We have just the outside plates and we have all the holes in the center selected as well. So if we can deselect the outside flat bits, that'll actually do the job for us. So I'm going to go to the top view, fit my selection, and then we want to use the rectangular selection. Make sure only select visible elements is unchecked, and then again we hold Control and we deselect those edges, and then we deselect the edges on the other side. Now what we're left with is just those holes selected, but again it looks like we need to grow the selection so that we get a little bit more on the outside. So we go to the select menu and we say grow selection, and each selection grows just a little bit. So we can texture these now as well. We can go to the select menu, say set selection. We can rename this to holes if we want. And then we can take a darker version of this rotor metal. So we can call this rotor holes. And just darken the material a little bit, maybe give it less of a specular shine. Well, that looks almost black now. Something like that. And then we can just drag it onto the rotor material. So now we have a lot of material stacked on top here. But that's okay, because we can actually just restrict the selection. So this is currently UVW mapping, and it still has our alpha channel, as we can see. So what we can do is we can uncheck the alpha channel. It should cover everything. And now we just select the material and drag the selection into it. So here we went from an object that had really no way to apply different materials to it, in that it was all one polygonal object, and we were able to apply a base material, a material along the edge, a material in a circular form near the inside of the object, and then a material to all of the inside surfaces of the holes. So all you need to do now is tweak those materials, and you can basically get any look for this rotor that you want. I feel like that's a good stopping place. About 20 minutes in, I think. So I hope you enjoyed this little bit of an update. And until next time, see ya.